first of all, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and I'm very excited, really, to kick off this new series, these seminars, which are called Finance for Healthcare Professionals. This has been in the works for months, and I'm really glad that we're getting started. First, I want to thank the leadership here at the VA for supporting this, particularly Dr. Amy Sanguinetti and Dr. Amneet Rai, and as well as my department chair, Dr. Alan Shapiro. Their support has been really invaluable, so thank you. So I just want to start with some disclaimers, okay? First of all, I'm a radiologist, I'm a physician. I'm not a financial advisor, so I'm not licensed in any state to give financial or tax advice, nor do I have any formal financial training. Everything presented here, therefore, is for your education and enjoyment. It's not intended to be specific financial or tax advice, okay? I do not work or consult with any financial firm, and I have no other conflicts of interest to disclose. So my background in terms of finance, I'm a physician, but I was a trustee for, before I came to the VA about a year ago, I was a trustee for a large physician private practice and oversaw retirement plans, basically defined contribution and defined benefit plans for about a decade, and oversaw up to like $12 million in plan assets. So I was a trustee and really learned a ton of experience from that. I also blog more recently on finance, and those are some of the websites that I've written articles for. I just love finance, and I love to write, so kind of combine those two, and that's what I like to do in my spare time. And then finally, for a couple years, I've been working on a book for children to raise financial literacy in children. And it's kind of targeted to middle school and high school target audience students. And that book I'm calling Raising Your Child's Financial IQ. It's going to come out at the end of the year. So that's the other thing. So with that, and make sure you pick up the handouts if you didn't. They're at the desk there. But there should be two handouts. One is this quiz that we're about to take, this short quiz, and then another is on this lecture itself. So I'd like to start with a quick quiz, 6 questions that FINRA, which is the Financial Industry Regulatory Agency, came up with and has been testing the population for the past, I think, decade at least. And these are the questions. So you can just go through these one at a time. I'll read the first question. Suppose you have $100 in a savings account, earning 2% interest a year. After 5 years, how much would you have? And those are the choices. Can you all read that? Yeah, okay. And it's also on the paper. Okay. Next question. Imagine that the interest rate on your savings account was 1% per year and inflation was 2% per year. After 1 year, how much would you be able to buy with the money in the account? More than today, exactly the same, less than today. 3 choices. Okay. Number 3, buying a single company stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund. True or false? Question 4. If interest rates rise, what will typically happen to bond prices? They'll rise, they'll fall, they'll stay the same. There's no relationship between bond prices and the interest rate. And then question 5, a 15-year mortgage typically requires a higher monthly payments than a 30-year mortgage, but the total interest paid over the life of the loan will be less. True or false? Okay, and the last question is a bonus question. Suppose you owe $100 on a loan, and the interest rate you are charged is 20% per year, compounded annually. If you didn't pay anything off at this interest rate, how many years would it take for the amount you owe to double? And those are your choices there. So I'll give you a few seconds. So we'll go through this quickly. Question 1, I think, is pretty straightforward. if you have 100, so the answer is more than $102. And the first talk today, this is actually just an introductory talk right now, and then we'll get into the next one in a little bit. It's on compound interest, so we'll go into this in great depth. But the answer is A. Question 2, the answer is it would buy less than today due to inflation. Question 3 is false. And question 4, what will happen to bond prices? If interest rates rise, they fall typically. And question 5 is true. This is a mortgage question, and it's true. And then question 6 is probably the hardest, maybe, I don't know, is how long would it take for your loan amount to double? It would be 2 to 4 years. And we will see exactly why that is in this talk. So. Thank you. So this test, as I said, has been given by FINRA many years, and the passing score they consider is 4 out of 5, and that's of the first 5 questions, not including the bonus question. And that's questions 1 through 5. The pass rate last year was only 34%. So basically what that says is that 2/3 of the population is what they consider financially illiterate. And only 7% of the population got actually all 6 questions correct. So that's where the nation stands. And if you go to their website, actually, you can actually look by state. And I looked at Nevada. Nevada is very similar to the national average, but it's a very interesting website. So this is a little bit more data on the literacy quiz that you just took. And what's interesting to me is that this is stratified by age, 18 to 34, 35 to 54, and above 55. You can see that, as it makes sense, it would make common sense that as you get older, you tend to learn a little bit more. So the highest pass rates are among the elderly. But in the past decade, the financial literacy of the eldest population, 55 or older, was pretty stable. But you can see that actually financial literacy has been dropping in the other age groups. And in fact, in the youngest cohort, 18 to 34, it's almost dropped by half, which is pretty amazing. The question is, why should you care about finance? And so I have a couple reasons why, and I'd like to go through them. And first of all, if you didn't do well on the test, I don't think you should feel bad about it, because the truth of the matter is we all start out financially illiterate. I mean, it's just a question of whether you stay financially illiterate or you teach yourself or attend seminars like this. Hopefully you become financially literate over time. Last year, again, a study done by FINRA called the National Financial Capability Study came out, and as we spoke, I highlighted here some of the interesting findings. Only about 1/3 of the general population, they concluded, had a basic understanding of financial concepts like interest rates, inflation, risk, and diversification. And then more disturbing is that they concluded that financial literacy matters, and that investors with low levels of financial literacy were more likely to exhibit poor investing behavior, such as diversifying poorly, failing to identify dominated funds, and pay higher fees overall. Dominated funds are just referred to mutual funds that have very high expense ratios or are inappropriate, basically, for investors. And they compared like an appropriate fund versus a non-appropriate fund or a lesser appropriate fund, which they called a dominated fund. So basically the bottom line is it really does have a major impact whether or not you're financially literate. So the second reason, I think, and I'm targeting this a little bit more to physicians, I'm sure there are a lot of physicians in the room, is physicians have a target on your back because not surprisingly, when you graduate from a resident to a physician, your income jumps substantially. And as a result, financial firms and financial professionals will target you because you make high incomes. A third reason, I think, to learn about finance and become financially literate is that conflicts of interest really abound in finance. As healthcare professionals and as physicians or any healthcare professional, I think we sort of naively assume that when we work with a financial professional that they're going to have our best interests in mind, because that's how we operate, right? We have the patient's interest in mind. That's first and foremost. But that is not really always the case in finance because there are these conflicts of interest. And just briefly, there are two sort of general standards that apply to the financial industry that are the suitability and the fiduciary standard. And without going into too much detail, a suitability standard simply means that the financial products that are offered to a client are suitable. I mean, they're appropriate, they may not be the best, but they're suitable. And so you can imagine that's like kind of like a physician saying, well, I could treat this illness with 4 or 5 antibiotics. I can really choose any of them. It doesn't have to be the best one based on the patient. I could choose, the least of the best, and that would be suitable. So there's a very different standard, I think, that the ones we're used to in healthcare. The fiduciary standard is a tighter standard. It basically requires clients' interests being placed ahead of the financial professionals. And that's really ideally what you want. And in fact, this standard was proposed and put forward over the past few years, but it was actually shelved or killed last year. And so, obviously the financial industry really doesn't want us to move to the fiduciary standard. The fiduciary standard really applies to brokerage firms and brokers. They only have to basically meet the suitability standard. So when you work with, a broker, they do not have to put your interests ahead of theirs. And we'll talk later in a talk about investment fees later on, just how many fees there are that they may or may not disclose fully to you. So the bottom line is these conflicts of interest cost investors a lot of money. A study recently showed that up to 1% of investors, it costs them up to 1% in fees, and that amounted to a sum total of about $17 billion a year. Fourth reason to be interested in personal finance, I think, is it's not neurosurgery. Personal finance is really not that complicated. I know it's intimidating if you've never really studied it or you don't really know anything about it, but the reality of the matter is there's some very core principles in finance, and that's exactly what this curriculum is about, is to try and teach these core principles to you. Benjamin Franklin said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. An analogy to this in financial education is an ounce of financial education is worth much more than its weight in gold. And we'll go into this in the next slide about how much you can actually save or how much fees you're actually paying when you work with a financial advisor. So this is an example. And so how much are you really paying in fees over your lifetime? So I am making some assumptions here. First, I'm taking the median household income of $59,000 a year. So that's just a fact. That's the median household income. And I'm assuming that the family works 35 years and that has a savings rate of 20%. And as we'll see, that's a high savings rate, but it's probably what I would recommend as a savings rate. And let's assume that they get a 6.2 annualized rate of return during their working years, and then once they retire, they are more conservative appropriately, and then they have a lower rate of return of 4%. And let's just assume that they have annual fees of 1.5% per year. Based on these assumptions, the total fees that will be paid by this investor, again, remember, this is the average household, is $444,000 by age 65, and then by 85, that will climb to $678,000. So these are pretty substantial numbers. Since a lot of you are physicians, I also ran the spreadsheet for physicians. So an average internist makes $230,000 a year. And using the same assumptions, a savings rate of 20%, 35-year career, and same returns of 6.2% and 4%, with the same fees, these are the fees that you are paying by the age of 65 in sum total. And by the age of 85, that climbs to $2.6 million. Now, I am not necessarily saying that you could eliminate those fees completely. You certainly could by being a total, you could eliminate them nearly completely by being a do-it-yourself investor, but even if you still rely on a financial advisor, I think being financially savvy and being financially literate will enable you to save a lot of this money in terms of fees and just get better advice. The sixth reason I think it's important to learn about finance is financial stress is a major contributor to burnout. And since I'm a physician and I know more about physicians, this is a huge problem, particularly for physicians. Just to show you, this is from that same study. This is just to the general population, not physicians. They were asked two questions, and these were the percent of respondents that agreed to those statements. The first statement was, thinking about my personal finances can make me anxious. So anywhere from 45 to 60% of people agreed with that. And then discussing my finances can make my heart race or make me feel stressed. And that was from 35 to 50% of people agreed with that statement. Going back now to physicians, this is, I don't know if you can read that, but this is a most recent Medscape survey of physicians and those who identify themselves as being burnt out. And this is by specialty. It's pretty depressing. And as you know, this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And anywhere from like 54% down to 28%. But study after study has shown that physician burnout is on the level of around 50% of physicians feel that they're burned out or exhibit one or more symptoms of burnout. As a radiologist, we're kind of somewhere there in the middle, 45%, but still, this is pretty depressing. And then finally, the last reason I think, and probably the most optimistic and hopeful reason to be financially literate and learn about finance is it gives you the opportunity to reach financial independence earlier. And to me, that means like really it gives you optionality, it gives you choices. Obviously one of those choices is to retire, but it doesn't have to be that. Now I want to shift a little bit to the course itself. This will be basically, first of all, let's talk about the goal. The goal is very simple. It's to enable you to become financially literate and highly capable of managing your own finances. So the curriculum will be divided up into 6 main areas: personal finance, fundamentals of investing, the practice of investing, and I'll show you what the difference is here in a second. I think behavioral finance is very important, actually. Behavioral finance basically studies the difference between knowledge and behavior. So I think it's great to learn about finance, but even knowing, everything about finance is one thing, like actually acting on it and doing the things you should be doing is a totally different matter. And that's kind of what behavioral finance addresses. Insurance, we'll talk a little bit about insurance, and then just some miscellaneous topics. And so let's go through these. Personal finance. The first talk today will be on compound interest and savings rate. That'll start here shortly. Some subsequent topics will be debt and budgeting. And I know debt is a huge issue for trainees in particular. I think the average medical student graduates with like $200,000 in debt. We'll talk about net worth and inflation, why that's important. For the fundamentals of investing, we'll talk about investing concepts, lay the groundwork. Of course, we'll talk about stocks and bonds and annuities. And we'll also talk about risk diversification, very important topic. And then the practice of investing will be a little bit more practical, where we'll talk about things like asset allocation and rebalancing, retirement accounts, taxes and investing, fees, and then finally building an investment policy statement. And we'll learn what that is later on. As I alluded to earlier, behavioral finance, we'll talk about what is behavioral finance, some of the common pitfalls of investing, and then one of the fascinating topics is actually, given this healthcare audience, is just the neuroscience of investing. There's a lot of recent research on that, so I thought that would be a nice talk to kind of put in there. Insurance, we'll talk about the basics of insurance, malpractice, and disability in life. I think life insurance in particular can be a huge pitfall if you don't know much about it, so I think we'll spend some time talking about life insurance. Some of the miscellaneous topics that I think will be interesting, and again, I'm totally open to suggestions for other topics. On the handout, chapter 1 is my email, so I'd appreciate any feedback that you have, including suggestions for topics. But these are just some of the ideas that came to mind would be like physician burnout, financial independence and how to reach it, how to compare job offers. That was more geared toward like trainees. And then a talk on like the 12 biggest financial mistakes or blunders people make. Some of the interesting topics to me are like market cycles and bubbles and also the yield curve. And again, these are just some possibilities. None of this is set in concrete at this point. But again, please send me, if you have ideas for talks, please email me. First course topic is compound interest and savings rate. So I think all the radiologists in our department know that I'm fixated on compound interest, and I love the concept because it's really fundamental to investing in finance. And we'll learn about that, about why that's the case. And what I like to say is, you know, wherever you are in terms of your finances, I think this Chinese proverb really applies. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. So, you know, it's never too late to learn. It's never too late to save in particular. So I just encourage you to, you know, think about this in an optimistic way. So compound interest, it's immensely powerful. Albert Einstein famously called it the eighth wonder of the world. It's also very simple, at least I think so, and I'll explain. We'll talk about compound interest and see why really, in essence, compound interest is just repeated multiplication. This is a great graphic, I think, because it displays the power of compound interest. You have time here on the x-axis, money on the y-axis, and this is your classic compound interest curve, right? Now, what I want to stress is, in the beginning, compound interest is pretty boring. I mean, you save, you put the money away, you invest it. You don't really see that much in the way of, you know, results in the beginning. So it could be hard. Like in the beginning, there's, you know, saving is a lot harder than spending, obviously, right? And it's boring in the beginning, but it's not until decades later that you really see the fruits of your labor, and where then, you know, investing becomes exciting. And this just demonstrates that in a graphic form. So as I mentioned, the obstacles to compound interest is that it starts out boring. You know, you think it's just nothing's happening. It's not easy to save, right? Behaviorally, it's much easier to spend. And then again, the fruits of your labor, the results, are decades away. And then I think also just the fact that people may not completely understand compound interest, I think is an obstacle. But really, compound interest is everywhere in finance. You know, if you use a credit card and you don't pay it off every month, that's compound interest. If you buy a car with financing, certainly paying for college or medical school, and the student loans, that's all compound interest. You know, buying a home, obviously, getting a mortgage is intrinsically tied with compound interest. Other things that you might really not have thought about, deciding when you can retire, whether to buy versus save, and then how to invest your money, of course. So it's really, compound interest is everywhere. Now, what I'd like to do is tell you a story about two people, and I think hopefully this will will illustrate the power of compound interest more than any, you know, explanation of its math. And I don't really intend to make this about, you know, becoming a millionaire or achieving a level of wealth. It's more just illustrative of the power of compound interest. So let's just take Sam the saver. He's a 22-year-old college graduate, okay? And let's say he earns $50,000 a year after taxes. And that's based on the median income. The US income is $59,000 based on the latest data. So after taxes, that's about $50,000 a year. So Sam is a good saver. He saves 20% of his disposable income, and we'll talk about what that is. Or 20% is 10,000 of 50,000 is 10,000. So every year, or at least the first year, he saves $10,000. Now he also gets a 2% raise every year. And what he does with that raise is he spends half of it, and then he saves half of it. So in addition to the first year saving 10,000, he takes every raise and takes half of it and socks that away in his savings as well. So the second year, he'll be saving $10,500, right? And he does this just year after year, very boring. And so going back now to savings rate. Savings rate, basically, if you don't know the definition, it's how much you save, which is basically whatever you don't spend, divided by your disposable income. And disposable income is simply that income basically after taxes. So Sam the saver, as you know, because he saved 20% the first year, but each year he's adding to his savings by every raise he gets, he's putting a little bit more away. His savings rate will generally increase over time. Like by the time he's 32, his savings rate will be 25%. And by the time he's 43, his savings rate will be 30%. So it's climbing slowly but surely over time. Now, Sam is also an investor. He takes his savings and he invests. And just for the sake of argument, let's say he invests 80% in stocks, 20% in bonds. And these numbers, he gets a 7% rate of return for stocks and 3% in bonds. And these numbers are based on long-term historical averages. And these are also real numbers. In other words, the rates are, and we'll talk about this later on in the talk on inflation, but there's a rate of return that after you subtract inflation is called the real rate, or real interest rate. It's basically whatever interest rate you get at a bank minus the interest rate, minus inflation is considered the real rate. So let's say he gets a real rate of return of 7% for stocks and 3% for bonds. And given the blended average of his portfolio, 80% stocks, 20% bonds, he will achieve an annual real return of 6.2% a year. Okay? Now, what does this mean? Now remember, he is 22 years old after college, and that's when he starts to save. By the time he turns 49, or basically 27 years later, he will have become a millionaire. And remember, this is your average US household income. This is not, some high earner. And then 9 years later, he will have increased his nest egg to over 2 million. And then just 5 years later, his nest egg will have increased by another million to 3 million. So this is really illustrative of the power of compound interest. This is exactly Sam. This is a year-to-year graph of Sam's nest egg. And the blue and the green, the total amount of his nest egg is the top line here. That's the value of his nest egg over time. And what I want you to think about, though, is the green is actually what he puts away. That's what he that's how much money he actually saves. Everything else is the blue. And the blue is really the growth of his money, which occurs through compound interest. And so what's startling is really by the time, he's somewhere in his probably, well, not that far, like in his 30s, more of his nest egg is actually in growth due to compound interest rather than what he actually saved and put away. And you can see that by the time he's close to retirement, like the vast majority of his nest egg is actually from growth and not even what he saved. So this is really, compound interest at its best. So I call compound interest kind of like Miracle-Gro, and it shows you that basically it took him a long time, right, to become a millionaire, 27 years, pretty long time. But for his second million, it only took him 9 years, and then for the third million, a mere 5 years. So that's exactly what you're seeing here is that, the next million takes much less time. Now we'll move on to another individual, which I'll call Frank. Now he's not quite as good a saver. And Frank is basically representative of the average American household because if you go back and look at the data, it fluctuates a little bit, but not that long ago, the average savings rate of the typical US household is 6%. But everything else about Frank is the same. We'll assume he's the same age when he graduates, he earns the same amount of money, gets a 2% raise each year, and also gets exactly the same return of 6.2% on his savings. So let's see what happens to Frank. So Frank amasses $1 million eventually, but instead of this happening at age 49, it happens 2 decades later at age 69. And if he lives to age 80, he'll have 2 million. It's really, I like to contrast Sam and Frank because it's kind of a tale of two millionaires. And, Sam, he reached $1 million at age 49, right? Now, what's interesting is at that point in time, he had been spending about $56,000 a year just based on, his income and his savings rate. There's a rule in finance called the 4% rule, which is very widely adopted by advisors. It's not a perfect rule, but is very commonly used. And basically what it says is when you retire, you can safely take out 4% of your retirement savings, and thereafter you can increase that dollar amount according to inflation. And so based on the 4% rule, like 4% of $1 million is $40,000. So if Sam went to a financial advisor, the advisor would likely tell him, well, Sam, you can send $40,000 a year this year. That would be a relatively safe amount so you don't run out of money in your nest egg. But Sam is like, well, Sam's conservative. He wants to save a little longer. So let's say he works another 5 years. By that time, his nest egg will have grown to 1.5 million. And at that time, his spending will also have increased to 61,000. But then 4% of his nest egg at age 54 will then be pretty much equal to his spending. So he could essentially then retire at age 54 and not have to change his spending habits at all, right? He could retire, continue spending 61,000 a year, and just be fine. Frank, on the other hand, remember he reached the $1 million mark at age 69. However, because he's only saving 6%, meaning he's spending 94% of his income, his spending has been about $114,000 a year. The 4% rule, one of the things about personal finance is it's pretty agnostic. It's just based on the numbers. So regardless of your need, the advisor would say, based on the 4% rule, the same rule, you can spend $40,000 a year. So this is going to be a huge wake-up call to Frank, right? He had been spending $114,000 a year. Now he's going to have to downsize a third, roughly, and cut his spending down to $40,000 a year. More than likely, he'll be faced with an unpleasant choice of having to work longer and probably having to save much more, or a combination of the two. So my point here is you don't want to have this wake-up call at age 69. You probably want to have that wake-up call when you're much younger and just realize the implications of compound interest. Benjamin Franklin, I like to quote him a lot. He called compound interest the money that money earns money. And let me explain what that means here in a second. So briefly, there's simple interest and compound interest, okay? So if you borrow $100,000 for 30 years at a 5% interest rate, with simple interest, you pay the same amount of interest every year, right? 100,000 times 5% for 30 years equates to $150,000 in interest, assuming you don't repay the loan until the end of the 30 years. So that is how much interest you would pay with simple interest. With compound interest, that number balloons to $332,000, or more than twice as much interest. So I think it's no surprise that banks and financial firms use compound interest rather than simple interest. It's kind of a no-brainer, right? So let's look at compound interest with a very simple example. If you put $100 in a savings account that earns 5% compounded annually, and I realize that's like pretty much non-existent right now, but maybe 10 years ago it was. At the end of the first year, you would have your principal, $100, plus your interest, and you'd have $105, right? The next year, you would have $105 at the beginning of the year. That entire $105 would then earn another 5% of interest. And then you would have, at the end of the second year, you'd have $110 and change. Going to the third year, that entire $110.25 would earn another 5% interest, and then you would end up with $115. And you might think, well, that's not that big of a difference, right? Simple and compound, that's not that big of a difference. But over time, it's a huge difference, as we saw. Year one, the amount of money that you have at the end of the year, M1, is simply your savings, S dollars, plus the interest on your savings, S times R, which is S times 1 plus R. Okay, at the end of the second year, you have M2, which is how much you started with, plus the interest that earns, and just substituting, you get S times 1 plus R squared, right? So the first year you have S times 1 plus R. The second year you have 1 times S plus R, 1 times 1 plus R squared. There seems to be a pattern here, right? Year 3, not surprisingly, you end up with S times 1 plus R cubed. So really what you're doing is you're multiplying what you have put away in savings or your loan amount. Each year you're multiplying it by 1 plus R, where R is your interest rate. And this leads us to the general equation for compound interest, which is that the amount of money you have at the end of any year, we'll call it T, year T, is what you started with, S, times 1 plus the interest rate raised to the T power. And this is the compound interest equation, basically. I want to talk a little bit about the different variables in this. S is how much money you save or borrow. T is the time you allow the money to compound. And R is the interest rate or the rate of return if you're talking about investments. So what I want to say is S and T are largely within your control. I mean, you determine how much you save, and you determine when you begin to save. And so the earlier you start saving, obviously, the larger T will be. On the other hand, R is a very important variable, and we will certainly talk about R a lot in these lectures, particularly when we get to investing. But you can raise R to some extent by increasing your exposure to stocks, right? Because we know that stocks have a higher rate of return in the long run than bonds and cash. But it comes at a cost, right? Because as you dial up, if you get a higher rate of return, as we'll learn, there's no free lunch. And with that, you will see, you take on higher risk or volatility. So you can increase your exposure to stocks and get a higher rate of return, but you also take on more risk. Now, proper diversification can lower that risk, and we'll certainly talk about that. But I think the point I want to impress is that I think if you go to any bookstore, go to the investing or business section, you'll see a ton of books talking about investing and how to maximize your returns and how to choose stocks. And they seem to be fixated on sort of maximizing R, the rate of return, but very few people talk about the importance of S and T, basically your savings, how much you save and saving early. But my point is that you can really control these things a lot more than you can control the rate of return R. So I would focus more on the S and the T. This again talks about the rate of return and how stocks have a higher long-term rate of return than bonds, than cash. But again, the price for that higher rate of return is higher risk. So the bonus question, if you know this rule of 72, this is a very handy rule and it basically comes from the math of compound interest. So I'll go over this just quickly. Is the rule of 72 is what you do is you take the interest rate that you have, could be an interest rate on your mortgage, it could be an interest rate on your savings account. You divide 72 by that interest rate. And that basically will tell you the number of years it will take for that amount of money to double. So if, as an example, if you had an interest rate of 9%, let's say you invested in stocks and you got a 9% return year after year, it would take about 8 years for your money or your investment to double. And so that's the utility of this rule. I will just finish up with some key takeaways from compound interest and savings. Compound interest, I think, is really the greatest force, the most important concept in finance, but really it's a dual-edged sword, right? It's wonderful if you're a saver, but it's not so wonderful if you're in debt. I think of compound interest as Miracle-Gro, but you could have all the fertilizer in the world, but if you don't have savings, it's really useless. So I think of it as the fertilizer, but savings as the seeds, right? And then the question is really, do you want to be a Sam or do you want to be a Frank? And what that really boils down to is your savings rate. And then we talked a little bit about the 4% rule in retirement. We'll certainly touch more on, we will talk a lot more about that in the section on investing for your retirement. I think this is a very important equation. I would definitely kind of look at that and make sure you understand it. I'm sure this audience does, but this is really the crux of the matter, compound interest. And And then again, I'd like to emphasize that we all tend to fixate on the R, the rate of return, but I think it's harder to increase that than you think. And I would focus more on savings and starting to save early, the T. The rule of 72. And yeah, I think I just covered that topic. Just again, a picture is 1,000 words. I think this is really says it all. This is what compound interest is about. Starts out very boring, but it gets very exciting in the end. And I think Albert Einstein put it really well in terms of the dual nature of compound interest. He said, "He who understands it earns it. He who doesn't pays it." So, with that, I'd like to end my talk and thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.